Товарищ первый секретарь Центрального комитета и правительства, майор Гагарин.
Gagarin to Khrushchev, a military salute.
The lights around here, who I'm sure some of you...
Glenn to Kennedy, a civil gesture with a different kind of hat.
It says on its first U.S. manned orbital flight, it has on it J.F. Kennedy, President, USA, and this will make him an honorary member of the launch crew. Glad to have you aboard, sir.
Two space pioneers at their homecomings. 10 months ago, Yuri Gagarin reported to his chief in uniform in the name of the Communist Party and the Soviet government. When John Glenn, in a charcoal gray suit and striped tie, met the president this morning, Mr. Kennedy spoke first. "I'm glad to see you again, Colonel." And Glenn's response, "Thank you, Mr. President. I had a good trip, and thanks for bringing my family down here." The homecoming of John Glenn. It happened this morning at Cape Canaveral, Florida, and tonight you're an eyewitness. Your correspondent, Walter Cronkite.
Eyewitness, the big news of this week. Tonight, witness, John Glenn's homecoming. Brought to you by Cyanamid. Tonight, Cyanamid joins the President and the nation in saluting Colonel John Glenn on his historic flight.
With the Vice President of the United States as his escort, John Glenn arrived home this morning to be met in Florida by his family.
This is bragging on you.
I know. This is good meeting you.
I'm proud of you. That's a great decision. He's a rock. Haven't we got a lot to be thankful for?
And we know, too. We know there was someone right there. Anyway, you went after him.
Until this moment, Glenn's only public expression had been a confident grin. At this reunion, tears of happiness.
And you'd have been so proud of this group in Washington. I've just been watching them in the paper, and they're so strong and brave. Tired her a little. Mother.
Here's Dad.
He's a television star.
How do you do?
Later this morning, the guest of honor became a host on a tour of Cape Canaveral. The president had flown up from Palm Beach to meet Glenn and to visit the scene where his triumph began. The tightly guarded reservation, which is our spaceport on the shores of Florida. This was their first stop, Mercury Control, the vast concrete shed that houses the nerve center of the launching operations. Riding with the president and the astronaut, the commandant of Patrick Air Force Base in the Missile Range, and the astronaut's mother. This is kind of a space-age general headquarters, a complex of electronic equipment used to direct the flight, to control it from the ground. And taking over as the guide on this leg of the tour is Mercury Flight Director Christopher Columbus Kraft, a marvelously apt name for a man involved in space exploration. At one point, looking at one of the complicated console boards, the president remarked, "That's quite a desk, isn't it?" This center is where the moment-by-moment information was collected all through the 4.5-hour flight. Information about the vehicle and about Glenn's physical condition and about the vehicle's position over the Earth. This is where the data was analyzed instantly, where decisions were made in consultation with Glenn as he hurtled around the Earth. And there's a familiar face to the whole country, astronaut Alan Shepard, who had his day of trial and glory last year. And this is Pad 14, another landmark, and for John Glenn now, a place with sentimental associations. Launch Pad 14, the site from which his rocket actually was launched. Glenn brought the president here to meet the launch crew that sent him off last Tuesday, some of them with fingers crossed. Glenn came back with a somewhat more confident gesture. The president served as toastmaster for a most informal ceremony.
In view of the fact you sent Colonel Glenn around the world on several times, he wanted to come back and thank you for it, I believe. Best launch crew in the business. I had to come back and talk to you. Mr. McNabb over here, one of the lesser lights around here, who I'm sure some of you have heard of, just handed me a hat here that says on it, First U.S. Manned Orbital Flight. It has on it J.F. Kennedy, President, USA, and this will make him an honorary member of the launch crew. Glad to have you aboard, sir. Seriously, for a moment here, I don't know how to express my feelings to all of you that took part in the launch. We'll be going through a lot of the data, of course, for the next weeks down here, and I'll be seeing more of you from time to time, and we can get into more of a description of some of the things that happened during the flight. But it was as near perfect a launch as I could envision. There's been a lot of press coverage about what I saw and what we did and some of the things that happened. It's just almost unbelievable the way things look from up there. The booster performance, as you're all well aware, was very near perfect. We were just very few feet per second off the velocity that we wanted. And I can't do anything but give you all my most heartfelt thanks and congratulations to every one of you for a job excellently well done. Thank you very much.
There's no one in our space program who's not heard of B.G. McNabb. Since its beginning, he's directed the Atlas program at Cape Canaveral. In the next bit of ceremony, the roles were to be switched. Glenn is the recipient, the president doing the honors. We'll see it in just a moment.
When a girl is reduced...
The only breath of formality in John Glenn's homecoming was a faint one. This impromptu speaker's platform had been set up outside Hangar S, the quarters in which Glenn waited out the agonizing delays and finally suited up when the go signal came. Today, for Glenn, Hangar S was the scene of presidential honors.
As Lieutenant Shepard, Major Grissom have learned, and as Colonel Glenn is now learning, the hazards of space flight only begin when the trip is over. And now that Colonel Glenn has been launched into public orbit, we are proud of him, as we are of all the astronauts and those who are connected with this great effort. 2 weeks ago, when Colonel Glenn came by the White House, I asked him how he enjoyed the public attention, and he said that he wished that they were paying more attention to the scientific part of this voyage rather than to his wife's hair. My own feeling is that both are equally important in the sense that we are proud of this trip because of its scientific achievement, and we're also proud of it because of the men and women that are involved in it. We may not, our boosters may not be as large as some others, but the men and women are. So it's my great pleasure to speak on behalf of all of our fellow Americans in expressing our pride and satisfaction to those so intimately involved in this effort. All of us remember a few dates in this century, and those of us who were very young remember Colonel Lindbergh's flight in Pearl Harbor and the end of the war, and we remember the flight of Alan Shepard, Major Grissom, and we remember the flight of Colonel Glenn. Colonel Glenn, you step forward. Years ago today, a group of Marines put the American flag on Mount Suribachi. So it's very appropriate that today we decorate Colonel Glenn of the United States Marine Corps, and also realize that in the not-too-distant future, a Marine or a naval man or an Air Force man will put the American flag on the moon. I present this citation. The President of the United States takes pleasure in awarding the National Aeronautic and Space Administration Distinguished Service Medal to Lieutenant Colonel John H. Glenn, Jr., United States Marine Corps, for services set forth in the following: for exceptionally meritorious service to the government of the United States in a duty of great responsibility as the first American astronaut to perform orbital flight. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn, orbital flight on February 20th, 1962, made an outstanding contribution to the advancement of human knowledge, of space technology, and in demonstration of man's capabilities in space flight. His performance was marked by his great professional skill, his skill as a test pilot, his unflinching courage, and his extraordinary ability to perform most difficult tasks under conditions of great physical stress and personal danger. His performance in fulfillment of this most dangerous assignment reflects the highest credit upon himself and the United States. Colonel, we appreciate it. Mrs. Glenn, who launched Colonel Glenn originally. They're right here in the front row. And also Mrs. Glenn and the, his name is Glenn Jr.? No, Dave and Lynn. And Lynn. David and Lynn. And we like to have you say a word to everybody here. All right, fine, thank you. Sit down, please. I can't express my appreciation adequately to be here in accepting this when I know how many thousand people all over the country were involved in helping accomplish what we did last Tuesday, and knowing how particularly this group here at the Cape and many of the group here on the platform, our own group of astronauts who were scattered all around the world and who performed their functions here at the Cape also, we all acted literally and figuratively as a team, and it was a real team effort all the way. We have stressed the team effort in Project Mercury. It goes across the board, I think, sort of a cross-cut of Americana, of industry and military and civil service, government work, contractors. It's almost a cross-cut of American effort in the technical field, I think. It wasn't specialized by any one particular group. It was headed up by NASA, of course, but thousands and thousands of people have contributed certainly as much or more than I have to the project. I would like to consider that I was sort of the figurehead for this whole big, tremendous effort, and I'm very proud of the medal I have on my lapel here for all of us, you included, because I think it represents all of our efforts, not just mine. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. President.
Now, John Glenn is shaking hands with his fellow astronauts back there. That's Scott Carpenter back, who was his backup pilot, and who eventually will get a flight of his own, as will every one of these astronauts. They have all made a great point of the fact that who is first is not important as long as they're all successful. And each of the flights will be intended to push along our space program with increased knowledge. The President is now looking inside the Mercury capsule that John Glenn flew into space. Vice President Johnson conferring with President Kennedy. As they stand stand here in front of Hangar S. In the background there's John Glenn. In the background behind Carolyn Glenn, that gentleman just behind President Kennedy, is Robert Gilruth, who was honored today with the same Distinguished Service Medal that has now been given to the 3 Americans who have traveled in space, because he, since even before the end of World War II, has been the director of America's manned space effort. He is the head of our Manned Space Center, as John Glenn now points out details of the capsule to President Kennedy.
So actually in orbit, the capsule is up like this, and it's traveling along in this direction with you facing backwards. You're looking where you've been most of the time. Now we went over to manual control part of the time and turned around so that we could tilt the window down and look in the direction in which we were traveling forward. And this is what you can tell that. Yes, sir. We have an automatic control system, but we also have the manual control system right here, and you can control it in pitch, yaw, and roll by 3 different motions of the hand controller here. So you can control the whole capsule attitude to whatever direction you want it to be in. You can't control the trajectory, of course, in a way that you set up your orbit. You can't change orbit, of course, but we can control attitude. Yes, sir. This is in fact, this is all burned under there now. You can feel it crystallized. And this is what ablates away and absorbs the heat of re-entry. Well, actually, it's like going to steam. This resin that this is made of actually boils away and goes to steam and absorbs this heat and takes it off. What is it they were talking about dropping? When they drop off? The retro rockets now normally sit in the middle of this package, or in the middle of the heat shield, out in the center of the capsule area. And those are the retro rockets that are fired to slow you down, so you come back in. And normally those retro rockets are dropped off after firing. There was some indication, though, on the ground that the heat shield might have come loose. So the only way of making sure that the heat shield didn't drop down and not perform its function during re-entry, the only way to make sure of that was to keep the retro rocket package on where it was. Keep its straps on so that it would hold the heat shield on. So this was the issue that was in doubt during re-entry. Tell him about your most anxious moment. Well, the most anxious moment I was telling the Vice President this morning was when this I thought the retro rocket package had dropped off and that we had a clear heat shield for re-entry. During re-entry, however, the retro rocket package was still on, and big flaming chunks of it burned off and came up around the corner of the capsule, and I could see them through the window. And at that time, since I thought that I had dropped the retro package, I wasn't sure. I thought possibly the heat shield was tearing up. And if this had happened, why, of course, the whole thing would just have disintegrated. It would have burned up. So that was rather, it was an interesting return.
In that brief, somewhat offhand explanation to the President, Glenn revealed for the first time just how close to danger he'd been on his flight. If, as he thought, the heat shield was peeling away, then he also must have thought he was hurtling into fiery disaster.
And that's, right there, and that's where he looked now.
And Mother, and the red color is the wings going in the darkness.
The periscope, he looks right into it and it's out the other end, not the bottom. So that's where he looks through. The first book you've gotten out of this one?
Look at it.
You hadn't seen the working area.
Now, did you sit with your head down here?
Yes. Head's right down in this area.
Here, Daddy, can you see?
And then body is down through here, and then legs up and in the couch here. This hand controller here. These are all the instruments here. The clock reset up here. Periscope face down in here. All the sequence panel that I was calling off different items on down along the left side. They want you to hold your hat down there a minute, if you would, please. These are the fuel control handles that I had on and off a number of times over here. This is the window area, see, up here. The periscope is out the other side, see. This is window area.
Then after it was going, you were sitting up.
For John Glenn's personal observations on his dramatic flight will return in a moment after this message. A declared policy of the American space program, public disclosure of the facts as promptly as possible. John Glenn makes his personal report to the public.
First off, it was quite a day. I don't know what you can say about a day in which you see 4 beautiful sunsets in one day, but it's pretty interesting. 3 in orbit and 1 on the surface after I was back aboard ship. But this is a little unusual, I think.
One of the great question marks and possible hazards of space travel has been weightlessness, the unearthly state that space explorers call zero-G, zero gravity.
Some of the things that happen under zero-G sort of demonstrate how fast, though, a human being adapts to this situation. I've recalled last night when we were discussing some of these things, the fact that I had this little hand camera once, and I had taken a picture, and I wanted to do something with a switch immediately, and it just seemed natural at that time, after I'd been weightless for, I guess it was a half hour or 45 minutes, I had acclimated to this rapidly enough that it just seemed perfectly natural. Rather than put the camera away, I just put it out in midair and let go of it and went ahead with the switch position here and reached back to the camera and went on with the work. And I remembered thinking afterwards that we were treating this pretty blasé at the time here, but I think it demonstrates, the point I'm making is that I think we all adapt very, very rapidly to these new situations.
Along with some answers, Glenn's flight produced some questions, like the mystery of the tiny luminous particles he reported seeing with each sunrise.
All I can say about these is I observed them. I saw them from the first light of sun to a period of some, 3.5, 4 minutes, that time period, made close observation of them. Occasionally one would come drifting up by the capsule window, very close, in the shade from the sun, and at that time it would look like a very small white particle. And they would vary in size probably from maybe pinhead size to something, say, about 3/8 of an inch in diameter, of that order. There are numerous things that some of the people are thinking about and looking into, but I have no theory myself, except we observed them. We saw it on all 3 orbits, about the same length of time at each sunrise. They were very luminous, a yellowish-green color. And as George Ruff, our psychiatrist, listened to this and said, "What did they say, John?" I think we've really hardly scratched the surface. We have a lot of attention focused on this right now, but our efforts really haven't gotten us very far into space, if you think about it. If you think of the diameter of the Earth being represented at some 100 miles to the inch, this would mean that the Earth's diameter could be represented by 80 inches approximately, which would only be about 10 inches higher than I am. If I held my hand up over my head, this would be of the order of 80 inches if I were standing up. Our orbital altitude, if that was the surface of the Earth, and I was the diameter line of the Earth, our orbital altitude would be about 1 1/3 inches above that, 80 inches. So perhaps if you think of the enormity of space, it makes our efforts seem a tad puny at this time. But these are all step-by-step functions we go through. As we said, all the manned flights we've had to date have added information. This flight, I hope, added a little bit more, and there are more to come.
A spaceman measures space. More on John Glenn's homecoming after this word from Beth. We have a long way to go, Glenn said. But his words apply not just to us, but to the Russians as well. For all the triumphs on both sides, for all the competition, we have both barely scratched the universe. Man is but on the threshold of this great new adventure. And perhaps in pushing out into the universe, the rivalries that divide and threaten us on Earth will be left behind. Perhaps in that lies the greatest significance of the flights of Gagarin and Shepard and Grissom and Titov and John Herschel Glenn, Jr. Tonight we have watched John Glenn's homecoming. You were an eyewitness. Your correspondent, Walter Cronkite.